Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Lauren Bennett, and I'm a clinical neuropsychologist here at the Pickup Family Neuroscience Institute at Hoag. Today we'll be discussing depression, anxiety, and memory. Let's dive in. So what I want to begin by saying is that some fluctuation in mood is a typical part of life. As many of you have experienced perhaps a loss of a loved one, a pet, a friend, you'll know that there are general variations in our mood as life circumstances happen and we respond to them. And that's okay. What we'll do in our time together today is do our best to differentiate between those symptoms of depression and anxiety that might be more situationally based and when there might be concern about the impact either cognitively, emotionally, or the intersection of both. Depression and anxiety are not a normal part of the aging process. So this is a very common misnomer that just because we continue on in the aging process, that folks will automatically experience some sense of depression or anxiety. And that's not the case, right? These are atypical. As we mentioned a moment ago, there are life circumstances that might prime us for some of these emotions. But when we meet diagnostic criteria for anxiety or depression, then that's the abnormal variation of these mood symptoms. And that's what we'll tease apart together in our time today. So let's begin with anxiety, right? Many of us have felt anxious before. Perhaps I'm a little anxious right now giving a public talk, right? That would be a great example of situational anxiety. Feeling a little nervous, perhaps speaking in a group or giving a presentation at work, feeling a little anxious about upcoming doctor's results or an appointment of some import. Those things would be normal situation anxiety. But let's talk about when it goes beyond that kind of normal anxiety. So now we're talking about excessive worry, meaning a disproportionate amount of worry based on the circumstance. So perhaps, I might worry about a test coming up at the end of the week. That would be appropriate. I might worry more as I get closer to the test in time and proximity. I might take the exam, feel some relief. However, the contrast is if I was worrying about a test 3 weeks from now, or 3 months from now, or perhaps worrying about failing my class altogether, even though I'm doing pretty darn well in my coursework so far. So if that worry feels out of sequence or out of step, inappropriate to the circumstance, that's when we start to get concerned. You might also notice another symptom of anxiety can be restlessness. This might come particularly in the nighttime hours. You might feel more restless rather than fatigued as your day wears on. You might also feel restless just as you're sitting throughout your day, perhaps while attempting to focus or concentrate. So for example, you might be trying to review some important paperwork and find that your mind really can't focus on the task in front of you. You might find that your mind wanders, or physically your body feels like it can't sit still. Similarly, as we were just talking about here, that impaired concentration can really come hand in hand with that physical, emotional, and kind of spiritual restlessness as well, feeling unsettled or out of step with your day-to-day life or your sequence or the circumstances around you. You might also notice particular fatigue. So for many folks that might be experiencing anxiety, they'll often comment that they just feel so exhausted. They feel like they run out of gas by 2 or 3 p.m. in the day. They feel like they really can't keep up with their responsibilities. Perhaps they're very overwhelmed by their to-do list, or even simple tasks or chores like grocery shopping or getting through paying their bills or other responsibilities might feel daunting or like they can't overcome them or climb that mountain. You might also notice difficulty sleeping, right? So this kind of fatigue level or perhaps a restlessness, but then when you do lie down to go to bed, you'll find that you're wide awake, right? So we've all had that experience where we're tired throughout the day, and then the minute our heads hit the pillow, we find we can't fall asleep, right? It feels like sleep is super elusive and not able to be something we can achieve easily, or certainly within the kind of 10 to 15 minute window that we expect to be normal when we're transitioning from wake to sleep. You might also notice increased irritability, so shorter fuse with loved ones, feeling more irritable or frustrated about cupboards being left open or dishes in the sink, things that might not normally bother you. A loved one not texting you back or not reaching out in the same timeline might be overly sensitive to or more sensitive than you usually would. And finally, muscle aches and soreness. So we can often see a somaticization of some of this anxiety, meaning that our bodies really start to pick up some of the tension, the nervousness might really translate into our muscles and create a soreness or achiness that you might be more aware of or more cognizant of in the day-to-day. So here are some common themes that I've heard, particularly in the context of the pandemic over the last few years from folks I've worked with. I feel like I'm failing at doing it all, right? Many of us are doing more now than we were 2 years ago, right? You might have spent some time homeschooling, for example. You might be doing extra errands or other chores for loved ones who maybe aren't safe to be out in the community. You may have been pulling double duty at work to cover for folks that have maybe moved on to other positions. You might be doing it all, right? You might be trying to keep up with multiple jobs, a higher workload, kids at home, friends that are stressed, the emotional mental health needs of your loved ones and family members. And I think for a lot of us, we feel like we're failing at trying to keep it all together and keep it all the balls up in the air. And the reality is we're being asked to do more now than we were 2 years ago. And for many of us, that continued marathon and that continued pace has really taken its toll, right? So this is a very common reality that I'm hearing from a lot of folks who are feeling really worn down at this point in time. I'm also hearing I need more, right? So at this point in that marathon, a lot of folks are realizing that it's just not sustainable. As I'm sure you're all aware, there are greater resignations at this point in time. So we're definitely seeing it in the healthcare sector as well, that folks are feeling burnt out or like they can't continue at this pace. Certainly you may have noticed that with loved ones who've decided to leave positions, look for new positions, find alternative arrangements in their work, or perhaps making changes in your family or your other support networks, right? So I think the first step that I want to comment on here is really recognizing when it's not sustainable and then asking for help or support or giving yourself permission to really reach out for those helps and supports when they might be useful to you. I'm often hearing from folks as well that they feel too anxious to sleep, right? So as we talked about incredible anxiety or fatigue throughout the day, feeling like they're just firing on all cylinders, but then by the time you hit your head to the pillow at the end of the night, you feel totally unable to fall asleep or get that rest that's even more important now than it has been ever before, right? So many folks are really finding that sleeplessness is exacerbating or aggravating some of these symptoms of anxiety day to day as well, kind of a vicious cycle that self-reinforces across time. A lot of folks are also sharing that they haven't maybe been exercising or eating right, which only makes them feel worse, right? So something I commonly hear is, I know what I should be doing. I know the routine makes me feel better. I know when I'm exercising. I know when I'm going to the grocery store, preparing my meals at home, I feel so much better than when I'm eating fast food or eating takeout or not taking care of myself physically. But the reality is that exercising and getting those chores done in terms of preparing your own meals at home, that takes an exorbitant amount of energy, right? And for many of us, that might feel like more gas than we have in our tank in this moment. And so the very things that would help us feel better often feel like the things that are just outside of our reach. And when we only have so much bandwidth in our day-to-day, it can be really easy for some of those self-care tasks to be the first things to go, especially when there are needs from our family, our loved ones, our work communities, our bosses, coworkers. It can be really challenging to continue to maintain that self-care and really prioritize that space for ourselves. Now, there are some particular anxieties that have come up specifically in the last 2 years in the context of COVID, but I'm also noticing that that's a lot of the social climate as well, right? So we had an election, of course, a lot of tension as well with some of the new racial movements that have really come to light in the last few years, and a lot of folks are feeling really restless and on edge, understandably, with so much uncertainty during this time. So what I really want to comment to is some of the pieces that were unique to this period in our time. So, of course, in the context of the pandemic, a lot of folks have had concerns about getting sick, continuing to feel sick after they've maybe recovered from COVID. And so I just want to normalize this, right? That it's been we're coming up on 2 years, hard to believe, but almost 2 years that we've been in this pandemic. And with that in mind, a lot of folks, of course, have in some ways habituated to some of the anxieties around getting COVID, right? Many of our loved ones or coworkers have gotten COVID, and thank goodness, hopefully many of them have recovered. Some may have not. But there's still a great fear of COVID out there. And as we head into this holiday season in particular, I just wanted to say that it's normal to feel some anxiety about your health and your well-being. We're still very much in the midst of this pandemic. And so I always encourage the folks that I work with to consider getting their vaccinations if they haven't, or their booster. Anything that might help take the edge off as you prepare to hopefully be surrounded by loved ones in a safe way this holiday season. And for many folks, we're feeling really concerned about our loved ones. Perhaps our aging parents or our friends. Perhaps you yourself might find yourself in the 65 plus demographic. And so you might feel a heightened anxiety because of your pre-existing conditions or your age or your work situation. And many of us are very concerned and continue to be about loved ones that are in high-risk situations. And that's normal, right? It's normal to feel that way, and even though, again, many of us have habituated to this constant state of anxiety, I want to pause here and just say that this is still very active and ongoing, and normalize some of that anxiety as well. This is more that situational anxiety that we were talking about. However, at this point, we're 2 years in, and so it's starting to feel like there may not be an end in sight for many folks. I also hear from some of my folks that I work with that they feel like they're not doing enough to help, right? This has been such a strain and such a period of challenge for so many folks, and we're often all looking for new and unique ways to help. The beginning of the pandemic, many folks turned to helping with food banks or other appropriate circumstances where there might be to volunteer or to give back. And the reality is of course, that we're still facing many challenges as a community, as a state, as a country, and of course, as a global community. So with that in mind, many folks are still looking for ways to give back and support. And that's one of the best things we can do, is find opportunities to connect with other people, to serve other people in a way that helps us keep our perspective, keep our own challenges in mind in terms of that perspective, and really continue to support one another and just love on each other in that way. So I often encourage folks to look for ways to volunteer, give back, mentor, connect, reach out to a friend, drop by with the flowers or perhaps a meal for someone that you know is just having an extra tough week. Really look for those opportunities to make small differences in the day-to-day lives of those around us and in our communities so that we can really feel like we're contributing and that we all are in fact, all in this together. I also hear from many folks that the news cycle that we're in, right? So this 24 hours a day, nonstop, several news networks, while it's so helpful to keep us abreast, right? Many of us get push notifications to our phone of major news events and what's happening. But the reality is we don't get a break, right? So the news may be increasing your anxiety, but many folks also can't really find a way to step away from the news or put down their cell phones or their devices. You know, so many of us are connected to the smart devices really 24/7 and virtually no break from that news cycle. And so what I've encouraged many folks to do over the past few years is to look at ways to be intentional about your interaction with the media and to get your knowledge, to get the information that you need to keep up to date with what's going on, but also to find ways to really protect yourself and to unplug in very intentional ways, to spend time being present with yourself in self-care and on your own, with your family, with your loved ones. Perhaps, you know, while at work, finding uninterrupted periods of time to really focus on your work without hearing the email notification pop up or the news, breaking news pop up across your screen. So really looking at your media consumption and choosing ways that really empower you to decide how and where you interact with the media in a way that feels supportive. So for example, some folks might choose to read the paper each morning, whether it be virtual or a physical paper, remember those. But they might not check the news for several points across their day. They might check in again at the end of the day. But choosing a media diet that makes sense for you and that will speak to your anxiety if you are feeling it, particularly if you find that yourself refreshing that news over and over again to get those updates throughout the day, is anxiety-inducing for you. Another comment that I often hear from folks I'm working with is that they don't feel like they'll ever adjust to the new normal, right? So what is this new normal, right? I look around at my colleagues in the room with me here and we're all wearing masks, right? With the exception of me, of course. But it's a new way of interacting, and there's barriers between us to hopefully keep us safe. But for many folks, that can still be really off-putting. And you know, I know we've all talked about some of the challenges of this period and what it looks like to have some of these safety precautions in place. And while that's wonderful in keeping us safe, it can really feel isolating in many ways, and it can serve to really cause this lack of human connection that so many of us crave, right? Even just small talk at the grocery store or a smile from a neighbor as you're passing by, we might miss some of those pieces day to day. And so I really want to encourage folks to continue to remind yourself that this too shall pass. This is temporary. And even though it feels like it might be never ending, that of course finding strengths and resilience and new ways to deal with this in these unique times, that hopefully this new normal will not be forever, right? It's just for now. And of course things will change moving forward, but finding ways to remind yourself of what's important, what your values are, and to seek ways to really connect with those values of import across different perhaps mechanisms, different platforms, different virtual means, even when we can't do it in person. And what I really want to say about all the pieces that we've just covered is that if you identify or any of these resonate for you, you're not alone. right? I don't know a single person who hasn't felt increased anxiety during the last 2 years, of course. That's human. That's very understandable. And changes across these past few years in sleeping, eating, activity patterns, meaning how much energy you might have throughout the day, are common, right? They're very common and understandable. So what we'll do today is do our best to kind of tease apart again what might be part of the situational anxiety in response to some of the stressors in our day-to-day lives, and then what might be going beyond that point and where we might need help or intervention to basically better support our mental health in some of these areas. Before we move into this next section, I'll just mention that anxiety is functional, right? So just as a brief reminder here, that part of our brain, our limbic system, that has what we call the fight or flight mechanism, that thing that tells us either to fight and face the lion or run the heck away and flee from the lion, that's an evolutionary mechanism that we have in place to protect us. And it's done really well, right? But here's the thing, fortunately, many of us don't encounter lions in our day-to-day lives, which we're very grateful for, but our limbic system, that fight or flight system, is still there, and it's still quite active. So the stressors might look different. Perhaps now it's that late email from your boss at 6 p.m. that makes your anxiety spike, rather than that lion that you're facing, right? And unfortunately, the mechanisms of our brain, our neural circuitry, hasn't adapted to say, okay, this is just an email rather than a lion, right? So we still have that lion level response, that spike in our cortisol, spike in our blood pressure, our heart rate, that really can serve to increase our anxiety in those moments and make us all feel like that lion might actually be right in front of us. The wonderful thing is we can thank our brains for taking such good care of us, right? There's a functional mechanism to protect us, to motivate us, say, to study for that test at the end of the week when we start to feel that anxiety, or better prepare for the presentation we have tomorrow. And this anxiety, this cycle, can help to inform our decision making. It's important to listen to these pieces in terms of our emotional response, but again, to remember that our limbic system is still the very same ones that our ancestors had so many hundreds of years ago, and so we're still going to have a lion level response, even though it might just be that email from our boss. So that perspective and using some of these tools that we'll talk through to hold that perspective will be really useful in the moment. Let's briefly touch on some of the depressive symptoms that you might be experiencing or have noticed in loved ones around you. You'll notice that there's quite a bit of overlap between depression and anxiety, so I kind of think of them as a Venn diagram, and again, many of the symptoms will look really similar, but let's breeze through them here. So again, not uncommon for many of us to feel sad or down or blue in response to the loss of a loved one, something in our day-to-day, loss of a job, or perhaps a colleague moving on, any of those normal day-to-day stressors that might come up. But what we're talking about in terms of really thinking about major depressive disorder is persistence, sadness, anxiety, or really an emptiness. Oftentimes folks feel guilty or hopeless, a sense that there may not be purpose or continued import to what they're doing or their work. I'll hear a lot from folks saying that they're not sure why they're getting out of bed in the morning, or that perhaps their work task or caring for others around them just doesn't feel as important as it used to. Along with that, you might have a decrease in your energy or your interest. You might find that you're not as motivated to see loved ones, or might be more socially isolated. Perhaps you're not engaging in hobbies that you really enjoyed previously, like gardening or baking or going out to get involved in a pickup basketball game. Again, we might see an impact on our sleep. So many folks with depression will have difficulty falling asleep and difficulty staying asleep. So what's particularly common in depression is really early morning awakening. So generally between 3 and 5 a.m. or somewhere about 1 to 2 hours before your alarm, folks might have difficulty maintaining sleep in that area. They might find themselves kind of startling awake, and then not being able to fall back to sleep over the normal course of 10 to 15 minutes or so. You might also notice that there's some difficulty paying attention. Just like with anxiety, really depressive symptoms can also eat up some of our cognitive bandwidth and make it challenging for us to focus. So let's, for example, say that maybe you had a conflict with a loved one. Many of you might have experienced this. The next day at work, it might be challenging to focus on a task in front of you that requires a great deal of concerted effort, right? You might feel like you are rereading the same page multiple times or rewriting the email, but you're not quite getting out what you want to say because some of your cognitive bandwidth, some of that available bandwidth might be taken up or preoccupied with some of the depression or the anxiety you might be feeling in response to, let's say, that conflict you had with your spouse or your loved one. Similarly, you might notice that there's a change in your eating habits. So sometimes folks will report eating a lot less, meaning that they have almost no appetite when they're depressed. For other folks, it means eating a lot more or finding that they're constantly hungry or can't feel satiated. Other folks might find that they're moving or talking slower, so a bradykinesia, meaning slowness of movement, almost feeling like you're moving through quicksand or underwater. The world can feel a little distorted, or just like it's harder, requires more energy for you to do those day-to-day tasks like we were talking about earlier. And some folks might experience thoughts of suicide, right? Wanting to harm yourself, or again, it could be more passive, having that feeling like it may be better if I didn't wake up tomorrow, or my family would be better off without me. So we can certainly see those symptoms as part of the depressive scale as well. Now, what I want to pause on here is that depression might look a little different in older adults, right? So it might look different in children, teens, adults, and older adults. And today, since we're discussing the intersection with memory in particular, we'll talk a bit about what that might look like in our older adult community. So in our older adults, we tend to see more of the fatigue, more tiredness or fatigue is a very common somatic complaint, again, meaning that we're feeling that fatigue or that tiredness in our body. We might also see that you're experiencing those changes in mood, but it might look more like agitation or the irritability side of it rather than the true depressive side of it. Might feel like you're shorter tempered, or again, getting a little snippier with loved ones or neighbors or church choir community members. You might also notice that you feel like you're having a bit more confusion. So more difficulty tracking conversations, particularly if it's a complex topic, like let's say you're preparing to sell your home, might have more difficulty discussing some of the financial transactions or the way that things might be moved as the complexity of the topic in particular increases. You might also notice that you're having more difficulty paying attention, which is very common, like we talked about with both the anxiety and the depression, but even more so with the decision making. You might feel a bit paralyzed in terms of making decisions for your future, or even what to eat for dinner tonight, right? It might just feel so overwhelming to pick a restaurant or pick what you're going to pull out of the fridge to prepare, that literally can feel so overwhelming for folks who are experiencing either symptoms of depression or anxiety that they really feel like they can't make those day-to-day decisions. Particularly in our older adult community too, we'll see a lot of memory concerns in folks that are experiencing depression or anxiety. So they might find that perhaps they weren't able to give their full cognitive energy when someone was giving them information, or perhaps they weren't feeling their best when they went to their granddaughter's dance recital. So they may not recall the specifics of a certain performance or who was there, a certain event. So we'll often see that there's some question of, okay, is this an emerging memory concern like a neurodegenerative disease? Or are we really seeing more the impact of depression, anxiety, some of that fatigue that we were talking about? And in our older adult population, we'll also see more kind of unexplained, meaning there's not an organic reason for it, the physical complaints. So things like kind of unspecified headaches, sleep disturbances, that achiness that we were talking about, or those muscle soreness. We'll see more and more of those complaints as well in our older adult population versus our younger adult or adult populations. Now, there are a number of risk factors when we think about depression and anxiety. So I'll use the term mood disorders. That kind of captures both depression and anxiety here. And one of our biggest risks for mood disorders are genetics, right? So you can thank your mom and dad, but many of us are hardwired to be a bit more anxious, right? You might know that about yourself, that you run a little anxious. Perhaps you have your whole life, meaning perhaps your friends when you were in high school weren't so worried about a big exam coming up, but you found that you were always the person to have a bit of rumination or anxiety leading up to it, perhaps even a few weeks in advance. And what that is a change or a difference in our brain chemistry, right? So we each have our own unique cocktail in terms of our neurotransmitters in our brain. And for folks that are experiencing more anxiety, they might have more or less serotonin, more or less of various neurotransmitters that impact our mood functioning day to day. And that, along with those same kind of unique biochemistry pieces, folks have different responses to medications as well. So as we move into our discussion about what to do about this, we'll talk about antidepressant medications, for example. And the reality is that we often don't know how different folks will respond to these different medication options. What works really well for one person may not at all work in terms of an antidepressant for somebody else. So the reality is that sometimes you've got to try multiple medications, just like a pair of shoes, right? I might love it, might fit great for me, might be a perfect fit, super comfortable. You might put it on and have blisters 2 minutes later, right? Same thing in terms of what we're talking about with antidepressant medications as we move into this next piece. I also want to mention that one of the risk factors that we look out for is personal history, right? So if someone has a history of, say, trauma or abuse in their past, perhaps they've had just life traumas in terms of a sudden loss of a child or a loved one, or been in a traumatic motor vehicle accident, all of those life circumstances in our history, even decades later, can have a great impact in terms of our mood functioning when something does happen in our life. So for example, let's say that you had a trauma many years ago, and then more recently you suffered a job loss, right? That trauma many years ago might be something that wasn't ever fully kind of dealt with in many ways. And so the combination of that past trauma and this current stressor might really be a unique combination that creates a mood disorder, increased anxiety or depression at this point in your life. And a lot of folks don't give themselves much credit. They'll say, why now, right? That was 20 years ago. Why is this coming up now? But of course, our minds and our body even really physically hold on to some of those losses or those traumas in ways that we can't fully predict when there's another exacerbating factor down the road. Another important risk factor is lifestyle factors. So things like sleep, right? I'm sure you all know this, but we are at our best, we get a good night's sleep. So if you've ever noticed that you haven't slept so well and the next morning, what happens, right? You might be a little snippier with your spouse. You might snap at your kids a little faster. Might be a little more frustrated or ticked off about the traffic than usual, right? So you might notice that you have less emotional resilience when you're perhaps not sleeping well or eating well, to our earlier point, right? Not eating foods that make you feel your best or not exercising. One of the greatest tools we have, as we'll talk about, is exercise. We know there's a huge impact on our mood just from exercise alone, right? If only we could put it into a pill so we didn't actually have to exercise. Wouldn't that be great? All right, let's talk about some of the additional risk factors that are prevalent in our older adult community. So of course, our older adults often are facing more chronic health conditions, of course, chronic pain conditions, all kinds of illnesses or chronic health conditions like hypertension or high blood pressure, high cholesterol, for example, diabetes. So you might be managing those different risk factors as well. And there are some medications used to treat these chronic conditions that can also have an impact on our mood functioning as well. So there's not only the risk of the chronic health condition, but also the medications or treatment we're using to help keep that condition at bay and appropriately managed. Those can also have an impact on that brain chemistry and our resiliency emotionally overall as well. Of course, as we age, the unfortunate part is that we often lose more of our friends and loved ones that are in our age cohort. So many times there's just a lot more stress in terms of losing loved ones. For many of our older adults too, there might be some loss of independence. So for example, maybe perhaps related to glaucoma, you might have, of course, changes in your ability to drive at night, for example, or your ability to live independently safely. Or perhaps it's just the loss of even though it's developmentally appropriate, but perhaps the loss of a career path or something that gave you a sense of purpose for so many years, right? And of course, in the context of the pandemic, a lot of folks have had that change accelerated. Many folks took early retirements, or perhaps you were already retired, but you were no longer able to care for a grandchild on a weekly schedule that you previously had, or able to volunteer at your church or another community center in a way that you did. So there may have been the loss of some of that purpose connected to the pandemic and some of the changes there as well. For many folks, we also see that there can be depression that co-occurs with other illnesses. So for example, some of the illnesses we have listed here on the screen can also have a direct increase in our risk for mood symptoms like depression and anxiety. So for example, we know diabetes, certainly cancer and heart disease, definitely any of the neurodegenerative processes like Alzheimer's or vascular dementias, Parkinson's disease. For many folks, there's a higher prevalence of mood symptoms, meaning the depression and anxiety in these populations as well. So as we age, there's certainly an increase in these risk factors that can again change our vulnerability to some of these depressive or anxious symptoms. What I'll say here is that, again, we're seeing an overlap between not only now the depression and the anxiety, but I'll add a third circle into our Venn diagram here of sorts, is that then there's this concern for memory, right, or dementia. And again, many of these symptoms can overlap, and so it can be difficult, at least initially, to tease apart what might be due to the depression, what might be due to the anxiety, and then what might be due to actual organic memory changes. So For example, in dementia processes, and we'll use that as the umbrella term here, but meaning if there's a change in your memory and cognitive functioning, we can see that folks have more apathy, right? Less motivation to get out and get engaged in activities. They may not want to socially connect with people because they might be more self-conscious about the fact that they're having more difficulty recalling the names of their loved ones' children, for example. So I might be less likely to want to go to lunch with a dear friend because I might be nervous that I'm not going to be able to recall his kids' names or where they got married, even though I was at that wedding 5 years ago. So it might be more difficult to engage in many of those social relationships for fear of some of those memory difficulties showing through. And I might also just have less interest, less desire, less motivation, right? So we call that amotivation or apathy. We can also see that folks just tend to really socially isolate in general from some of these disease processes in the dementia umbrella or under the dementia umbrella. So what we'll see here, I'm going to just kind of highlight some of the basic symptoms that are commonly presented to our primary care providers. And then our job as your medical team is to try to tease apart what might be due to the mood symptoms versus what might be due to the memory and cognitive disorder concerns. So again, we'll often see that folks present with difficulty concentrating, memory difficulties, again, about recalling specific details of events or conversations they've had, slower processing speed, so feeling like it just takes them more time, more energy to process information, either in their day-to-day life or in a conversation they're having. They might have increased difficulty making decisions like we were talking about, or planning or organizing. So it might feel just more overwhelming, for example, to plan a trip or even think about planning a trip. Of course, that's compounded by all of the health risks that go along with that right now. We also might see a decrease in self-esteem like we were talking about, so feeling less confident in my ability to go into a social situation and engage in small talk or hold on to information that people have given me in the moment. So as you might imagine, there's quite an intersection of many of these different pieces, the mood symptoms and perhaps an emerging neurocognitive issue. And so again, our challenge as your team will be to tease apart what might be due to what. So we'll have some conversations now about when we should be concerned. So what I want to say next is just that the prevalence of depression and anxiety in older adults is 1 in 4, right? So across the lifespan, so once we hit 65 and older, 1 in 4 older adults at some point during their older adult chapter will experience symptoms of depression and anxiety. So if you find that you identify with that statement, you're not alone, right? This is very common. About 25% of folks have some symptoms of depression and anxiety. And the great news is that we have lots of viable treatment options to help folks feel more buoyant in terms of their mood and reduce the impact on their cognitive functioning. So what I'll pause here and say is that we actually know that folks that have untreated anxiety and depression, both in midlife and in their older adult years, are actually more vulnerable for risk of neurodegenerative diseases down the road. So we've got really compelling research. So it's very important that we proactively treat many of these mood symptoms because they can actually change our risk down the line for developing Alzheimer's disease, for example. So when should we be concerned? What's some objective kind of data points that we can have about when we should reach out to loved ones or our community? So let's talk through when it might be pertinent to reach out to someone in your circle, like a loved one or perhaps a primary care provider. If you're feeling like these symptoms of depression and anxiety are not lifting, so let's say perhaps you've had a loss of a loved one and you find that things are not getting better with time, right? Perhaps you're still feeling quite tearful or sad day to day several months after the loss, or you feel like the symptoms are overwhelming or real key here are impairing you in some way in terms of your day-to-day functioning, meaning that you're finding that you can't be socially engaged in the way you want or engaged with your community outside of that, meaning work or other commitments you might have. But if you feel like these symptoms are impacting your day-to-day functioning, it would be really helpful for you to reach out to a treating provider or perhaps a loved one to help you connect with the appropriate doctor to get an assessment and to see what might be done. If you're finding that you're worried every day, most days, for the length of the day, it might be helpful, of course, then to reach out. And if you're noticing changes in things like your sleep patterns, your eating patterns that are not changing over time, but rather kind of staying pretty set, meaning you've had a decrease in your appetite and you're really not finding that it's coming back after a short period, it could be helpful to reach out again to your primary care provider, a psychiatrist, or perhaps a loved one who can help you connect with someone of that sort. Now, again, I always recommend the starting point should be your primary care provider because they're often the person who knows you best. And then they can make an appropriate referral perhaps to a psychiatrist or a mental health provider like a talk therapist or a psychotherapist. So they might be the perfect person to speak with about some of the changes you've noticed. Many primary care providers will also make recommendations about antidepressant medications if they feel like it's appropriate and within their scope, or if they feel like more intensive care might be helpful, they might refer you out to a psychiatrist at that point in time as well. What I will say, as we talked about, is that some medications and medical conditions can cause some of the same symptoms of depression and anxiety. So it can be really helpful to start with your primary care provider because, of course, they'll know your chronic health conditions, they'll know the medications you're talking about and taking so that they can help to determine if there's any risk of any of those conditions or medications having that impact on your mood. They can also rule out the possibility, of course, by doing a physical exam, an interview, and any lab tests, that any of those medications might be negatively impacting you, or there might be something like a vitamin B deficiency, for example, that can have that impact on your mood as well. And if your doctor finds that there's not a medical condition or a medication you're taking that's causing these mood symptoms, the next step would be a psychological evaluation. So again, they might refer you out to a colleague, or they might do this themselves. And then the most common treatments that we use to help treat these mood symptoms or mood disorders are psychotherapy, talk therapy or counseling, and medication. So again, most commonly we use antidepressant medications to help with both depression and symptoms of anxiety. So let's talk a bit more about psychotherapy. So for most folks, we kind of get this Freudian image of lying on a couch and talking about our childhood. I'm here to tell you that's not quite what we do for most of us any of these days. So for many folks, you might even find benefit from a really brief intervention, meaning 3 to 5 sessions. Most folks find somewhere between 10 and 20 sessions to be helpful. And the most common treatment modality that we use for therapy for depression at this point in time is something called cognitive behavioral therapy. And what that is it's really challenging our thought processes and the way that those thought processes impact our behaviors and choices, and finding a way to interrupt some of the cycles between those thought processes and that behavioral pattern or cycle. So it's all about changing that negative thinking that might have, again, that cyclical impact on some of those depressive or anxious symptoms. Often alongside of the cognitive behavioral therapy, we'll use something called interpersonal therapy. So this can be particularly helpful if you're working through troubled relationships that might be exacerbating the depression. So for example, if it's not just the thought processes and your own behavior, but you really might benefit from helping to examine some of the relationship dynamics, your interaction styles, sometimes we'll use in conjunction with the cognitive behavioral therapy an interpersonal therapy approach, again, either independently or in conjunction. And then as we mentioned, so antidepressant medications, there's lots of different types, right? We have all different kinds of antidepressant medications. Like we talked about, all of them are going to work differently for different folks. So the goal of the antidepressant medication is to balance the neurotransmitter, the neurochemicals in our brain, so that we can achieve a balance that helps us feel our best, right? That can take effect over kind of a longer period of time. So what I will say here is that many of the medications we use, many of the antidepressants, take about 8 weeks to take their full clinical benefit or impact. Some of the medications have a shorter startup time, so if you're feeling like you're in a darker place or want a more immediate impact, please do share that with your prescribing provider. But generally, we'll need 8 full weeks to see the impact. I will note that there can be improvements in some of the physical symptoms, things like sleep, appetite, concentration, that improve before the mood lifts. So 8 weeks is usually the full kind of impact of the medication at that point in time, but you might see some earlier changes as well. Really important note here on antidepressant medications is to never stop taking the medications without first discussing that with the primary care provider. So as you might imagine, if folks are taking an antidepressant medication, they might find that they suddenly are feeling a lot better day to day, and they might feel like they no longer need the medication. But these medications take a long time, as we mentioned, to build up in your system over time. So it's very important that you discuss with your primary care provider, whoever's prescribing the medication, about your desire to taper off the medications. You can do that safely under medical guidance. We never advise you just to go off of it cold turkey because there can be some pretty significant impacts medically at that point in time. And generally what folks do is that they find that there's a period of time, usually for many folks it's 6 to 12 months, where being on the antidepressant medication can help to change that brain chemistry slowly over time, so there might be less and less need for the medication. So we actually see changes in our neurochemistry from being on the antidepressant medications right around that 12-month mark for most folks. And so they might find that they no longer need to be on the medication. So one misnomer is if I go on an antidepressant medication, I might need to be on it forever. That's often not the case. So I'll encourage you to talk with your primary care provider or whoever's prescribing your medications if that might be something you're interested in having a further discussion about. And then when it comes time, it's of course important, like we said, to work in tandem with your provider to slowly taper off the medication and decrease your dose so there's not a rebound of any of these symptoms. And of course, you're doing it in a medically safe way. If you're having any side effects, oftentimes folks will see that those will present earlier than the full clinical value. What I mean by that is that usually around 3 weeks in, folks will experience some of the side effects, if there will be any, from the medications. So it's important to share those with your prescribing provider as soon as you notice them so that they can have a conversation with you about whether they might be expected to level out over time. Again, most folks might experience some brief side effects, and then they might actually dissipate over time. But you'll want to share that information with your prescribing provider so you can make an informed decision. The other thing I'll mention, of course, is there are some herbal medications, for example, St. John's wort, which many women take in response to menopausal symptoms, that can have negative impact on our antidepressant medications. So it's very important to tell your prescribing provider all of the medications and supplements you might be taking so they can make the best choice about which medication might be appropriate for you. All right, let's talk about non-pharmaceutical approaches here. So as I alluded to earlier, some of the best tools we have available are free of charge and totally available. You ready for this? So best ones we have available to us are sleep. If you can get your sleep in check, which I know is challenging when you're not feeling great in terms of your mood functioning, but if you can get your sleep in check, we see incredibly positive impacts on usually symptoms of depression and anxiety. Now, as you're, I'm sure, thinking to yourself, that's of course impossible because it's the symptoms of depression and anxiety that are often causing some of the mood challenges. But we do have really great behavioral interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. We have a program available through Hogue. I'll also point you there if you're interested to our community classes for sleep that can be really useful to helping to get those behaviors in check even when you're not emotionally quite there yet. So if you can get the sleep in check, you can actually see an incredible improvement in terms of the depression and the anxiety for some folks. The other best possible treatment we have available to us is exercise, right? So some of these lifestyle factors, the sleep and the exercise, can be incredibly impactful even above and beyond medications, and especially when taken in conjunction with some of the medications we've discussed today. So I'll encourage you to really consider some of these lifestyle interventions because they have just a world of science behind them in terms of really strong, compelling data about the impact on our mood. We also can see really positive improvements from things like diet, social engagement, and purposeful activity. So that's back to the volunteering, finding opportunities to help love on our community, taking dinner to a friend who might be having a particularly tough week, like we mentioned. And then one of the best things we can do for mood symptoms is to intervene early, right? So we have the greatest chance of disrupting the course of depression or anxiety when we catch it as early as possible. Getting involved in talk therapy or psychotherapy and considering medication well before it is a significant mood disorder can be really helpful in terms of pacing that down so that you're not finding that you're in such a dark spot at that point in time. We can catch it before it goes into the full-blown major depressive disorder. All right, so what I'll wrap up with here are just a few resources that are available in our community. So I wanted to share that we have a general mental health non-crisis line. The NAMI Warm Line. So I've included the phone number here. There's a toll-free phone number. And then also there's a live chat option on the website that's listed below. It's namioc.org. And the NAMI OC will be community-based resources here for us in Orange County that are particularly wonderful for all kinds of mental health challenges, and not folks that are just experiencing mental health challenges, but also their loved ones as well. So there's a lot of caregiver support groups or loved one support groups that can be a really wonderful starting point if you have any questions or want to better understand how to support your loved one. I also included here the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is a national government agency that has a disaster helpline. So two options there. There's a phone number listed. There's also a text option listed as well. And then the final option on this page here, the connection with OC Mental Health Resources. Again, this is an Orange County-based resource. It's a hotline that you can call if you need any support or services, and they'll help connect you with available supports in the community and available providers that might be a good fit. Few more resources here. So I did, of course, want to mention that we have a national suicide prevention hotline. Phone numbers listed there on the page. Also a text crisis line option as well. So those are also available to you at any point in time. They're staffed 24/7. They're a phenomenal resource, all confidential. So if you're feeling any symptoms of wanting to harm yourself, or even, again, that passive suicidality, really wonderful community resource there. And then we also have the substance abuse support group available through AA and NA. So I've included those websites there. Many of them are meeting virtually, of course, because of the pandemic, which makes it really convenient for a lot of folks that might feel like that would be an extra support if you're finding that you're dealing with any kind of substance challenge at this point in time. And I'll wrap up with these final resources here. We've got the domestic violence hotline, as well as intimate partner violence has spiked, unfortunately, during the pandemic, so that's a resource. And then NAMIOC, back to NAMIOC, they have a wonderful community resource page for all things COVID related. So for example, financial supports or other kind of community grants or services. So a really wonderful starting point if you find that you might be in need of any kind of logistical support during this period as well. And of course, if you are noticing that you have any changes in memory or mood functioning, like we've been talking about today, that you feel like exceed kind of normal aging, it's very important to follow up with your medical provider, generally, again, starting with your primary care provider. We also have a program here at Hoag called the Orange County Vital Brain Program. It's a wonderful 45-minute screening program. You come in and meet with a mental health provider to talk through any changes you may have noticed in your mood, in your cognitive functioning. You'll do an objective verbal memory task to get a look at how your verbal memory is. And then those folks will provide specific referrals, either in the community, to a neurologist, a psychiatrist, psychotherapist that might be helpful for you, or other programs like grief share, grief support opportunities, other community-based mental health supports, whatever might be a helpful asset for you at that time. Okay. So I'll check in now to see if there's any questions. No questions. All right. All right. Well, I so appreciate you all joining us today. Thanks for taking this time to, again, prioritize your mental health. And I hope that you all have a wonderful holiday season. Thanks again.